Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. Every New Beginning by Fencer X. Episode 9. After their stumbling start, the days spent in the room together building one another's confidence and skills in concert dragged on into weeks, and the lazy, sticky notes of summer took on a crisp bite in the evenings, heralding the coming Scottish winter that Harry had somehow both sorely missed and been glad to see the back of. By this point, Harry was spending as much time inside the room as out of it, and every pinched frown and furrowed brow Hermione threw his way sent another guilty jolt through his chest. He knew he was neglecting both his studies, the off-the-book ones at least, as well as his friends, but he couldn't exactly invite Malfoy into the Gryffindor common room for a postprandial cuppa and a game of wizarding chess. Well, he could, but Malfoy would probably decline the invitation with as much huffing and sneering as he'd displayed when he'd turned down the prospect of joining the Aurors. Harry knew this was how Malfoy would react because, over the month and change now they'd spent training in the Room of Requirement together, Harry had gotten pretty good at reading and navigating Malfoy's moods. So much so that now they could go days at a time without one or both of them storming off in a snit. He was even pretty sure that Malfoy, too, was tempering his words and mannerisms, training himself to avoid being quite as insufferable as Harry knew him to be capable. In fact, Harry'd had to adjust his earlier consideration that he and Malfoy being on cordial terms was at all odd. Quite the contrary, it was easy as pie, almost too easy at times even. They would hit on a rhythm, something effortlessly slipped into and not easily escaped until they were rolling through a lesson or halfway cracking jokes at safe targets with disconcerting ease, neither one realizing they weren't being horrible to each other until full hours had passed. And it was in those moments that Harry thought there might be something sort of, approaching friends. Well, acquaintances, maybe. Malfoy was no Ron, nor was he Neville or Seamus or Dean. He wasn't even Justin Finch-Fletchley or Zachariah Smith. Malfoy had fought in the war, but not at Harry's side, not even on Harry's side. And that left a gap between them that a few conversations commiserating over the workload McGonagall had set them this term and one deftly managed bat-bogey hex that Ginny would have approved of could not so easily bridge. Harry knew this camaraderie he was starting to feel with Malfoy wasn't real, at least not outside the room, but it was still camaraderie of a sort, and maybe they hadn't fought on the same side in the war, but they had fought, and for similar, if not the same, virtues. So Harry let himself privately indulge in the excitement of finally, for the first time in ages, having made a new friend. He hadn't had one, and he couldn't remember how long. Everyone of eligible age was either already a friend or already a fan, and there was to be no mixing of the two in Harry's book. He had friends of friends, Hermione's co-workers, and a few of the younger Diagon shop owners Ron had standing drinking dates with, but none he could really call his own since leaving Hogwarts. There was a kind of dangerous thrill that came along with letting someone new close enough they could hurt you if they wanted, and no one would ever accuse Harry Potter of not seeking a few thrills. It was like training a wild beast to eat out of your hand, knowing it could rip your arm off but was content to nibble on an apple core instead. Malfoy would probably not appreciate the comparison, but as it was all happening in Harry's mind, he had no say in whether or not Harry sometimes looked at him and thought, "Hippogriff, a dragon's just too cliched." Kreacher would bring them meals sometimes, if they practiced through lunch break or missed the dinner rush, which was nice both for the convenience and because Harry had really missed Kreacher's cooking since ceding both him and Grimmauld Place over to Andromeda and Teddy years back. Kreacher, for his part, was just as Harry remembered him, and seemed pleased as punch to be once more serving meals not only to the wizard who avenged dear Master Regulus's brave sacrifice, but also to the last remaining Black Heir, even though Harry itched to remind Kreacher that he technically was the Black Heir, as Grimmauld Place and all its contents had been left to him. House elves, as old as Kreacher, were set in their ways, and no amount of explaining the finer points of wizarding contract law would convince him otherwise. Harry tried not to miss too many meals stuck in the room, though. People talked enough about how Harry never seemed to be about anymore, and he didn't want unseemly rumors about his conspicuous absences following him back to the future. Malfoy, though, was another story altogether. He didn't seem to like leaving the room except to attend classes and meals, and Harry began to wonder if he even maybe still slept in the room some nights. He'd dismissed the idea the room was an 8th-year dorm after his first visit, but that didn't mean Malfoy didn't sometimes purposefully miss curfew after Harry left to return to Gryffindor Tower. The urge to peek at the map and see for himself was there, a niggling little thought, but he told himself it would be rude to violate Malfoy's privacy that way, and that he was past spying on Malfoy, especially as Harry well knew he wasn't up to anything this year. It did get a little boring, though, the both of them cooped up in the room with nothing but their studies to occupy them. Malfoy soaked up jinxes and hexes like a sponge, though his charms work was slower going, and Harry had actually managed to avoid reducing any cauldrons to molten heaps of metal for a solid 2 weeks now, a new record. Harry was used to a fair bit of action and danger, though Malfoy seemed perfectly content to enjoy a nice, quiet 8th year free of the dour spectre of madmen with Machiavellian tendencies and their murderous hordes. They had at least managed to get the room to supply a passable Quidditch pitch, an experimental product of one frustrating evening when neither wand work nor bench work had quite been cooperating. They'd even managed a pair of nondescript brooms, complete with the requisite flying and levitation charms embedded. There were certainly no firebolts or nimbuses, but this way Harry and Malfoy were evenly matched, when it came to equipment at least. As for talent, well, Harry wasn't getting his arse handed to him, but he'd had to remind Malfoy on several occasions that he was nearly 7 years out of practice now, unless you counted the old Weasley family Quidditch games at the holidays, so his reflexes weren't quite what they'd once been. "All I hear are excuses, Potter," Malfoy had scoffed, the flush of victory high on his cheeks and broom slung over one shoulder as he waved the freshly caught snitch under Harry's nose. "Perhaps once you've managed troll level or better in your potions nuke preparations, I'll give you a few pointers." Harry was ready to give him a few pointers, especially given Malfoy insisted on performing a ridiculous victory dance each time he bested Harry in a Seeker's game, which was more often than Harry's ego could stomach, that Harry might have found terribly amusing if he hadn't had to witness it on the heels of a bruising defeat. But even finally managing to eke out more wins than losses, muscle memory eventually taking over to guide his body through maneuvers his conscious mind had forgotten, wasn't quite enough to keep cabin fever at bay, and Harry found he needed to get out, to be around people, plural, in a setting outside the classroom or meal times. He needed to socialize en masse, and he felt like Malfoy probably did too. Malfoy in the future had been isolated and ostracized by his friends as well as the community at large, and Harry was certain that lack of a social network to offer support and a helping hand had contributed to Malfoy's downward spiral and eventual demise. Perhaps then, if he helped this Malfoy rebuild his own web of contacts, or even construct a new one involving more than just fair-weather Slytherins, he'd have less reason to run, less reason to get caught, and less reason to let himself get drawn into whatever it was the Neo-Death Eaters had wanted with him. This, though, was a trickier feat to manage, organically at least, than learning a new charm or transfiguration spell. Malfoy's pride might bend enough to allow Harry to meddle in private, but if he thought Harry was trying to set him up on the platonic equivalent of a blind date, there'd be hell to pay. Harry therefore had to go about this subtly, which was, in fact, quite difficult for him. He was pretty sure, too, that Malfoy suspected he was up to something, but perhaps thinking it would be more entertaining to watch Harry try and fail at whatever he was about, Malfoy never pressed him for details. So that was when Harry invited Malfoy to join him in Hogsmeade on the upcoming weekend. "Absolutely not. Are you mad?" Malfoy had scoffed. "I doubt I'm even allowed." He was. Harry had checked, just in case. "Come on," Harry had wheedled, pasting on his best entreating expression, though he knew it would have no effect on Malfoy. It might even encourage him to hold his ground, actually, just to break Harry's heart. "I know a way we can sneak down, a private shortcut, so no need to mill about with the unwashed masses. And I've asked Aberforth to save us a table at the Hogshead, since it'll be packed otherwise. You won't have to mingle if you don't want to." Malfoy had cut him a strange look then. "Save us a table? What in the ever-loving fuck for?" "Well, it's Halloween weekend. If I don't have Aberforth reserve us seats, it'll be standing room only. And I figure there'll be you and me, and Ron and Hermione, and Neville and Seamus and Dean, and probably Ginny and Luna too, though I haven't asked them yet. Maybe more if I can get word out. Either way, we'll need a bit of space. Aberforth's got a booth in the corner with an undetectable extension charm on it, I'm pretty sure." "You invited your lackeys? Good gad, you mean to have them murder me, don't you? That Dementor talk was poppycock. I'm meant to live a full, healthy life, and you've just come back to see me done in by Gryffindors." Harry had rolled his eyes at Malfoy's dramatics. "As if I need help murdering you. I nearly managed it the once without even trying." That had driven Malfoy back a step, rubbing at his chest with a wary glower. "And Luna's a Ravenclaw, you know. You need to get out more, need to talk to people more. Used to be we couldn't get you to shut up, and now you're locked away in the room 23 hours a day, it feels like. Stability's what's going to get you through any rough times ahead, and a steady job's only going to half help. A circle of friends, even Gryffindors, can go a long way to making up the other half." Harry had lifted his brows. "They're good people, I swear. Show some effort at being decent, and they might even give you a pass on the 50 apologies you owe them all for being an arse-tit for their entire school career." This had pulled a sour frown from Malfoy. "I'm not a child. I don't need you coddling me. It's not coddling, it's doing what I can to make it so you'll want to come. Because we've been sitting in this room since September and it's starting to drive me mad. Then by all means, leave." They'd gone around in circles like that several times over the course of a week, each variation building on the last as Harry wore Malfoy down. He invited his friends, of course. It was time he showed them the fruits of his labours. And then he invited any Slytherin in their year he could pin down. Neville he prodded into cornering Blaise Zabini as they were both taking Newt-level herbology, and Parvati had been tasked into extending an invitation to Pansy Parkinson, with whom she shared a desk in potions. Harry could probably have approached her himself, but even 7 years later he could still hear her shrieking in the midst of the great hall that "he's right there!" and so had no desire to interact with her any more than might be required if he was to be chummy with Malfoy. Neville and Parvati had pulled through, though, and Harry had used the attendance of 2 whole 8th-year Slytherins as the final carrot in his pocket before he resorted to using his stick. Malfoy had gaped when Harry had informed him that both Zabini and Parkinson had agreed to a Hogsmeade get-together, and Harry wondered if he'd done the right thing after all. "They actually agreed to this madness? Did you even tell them I was going to be along?" No," Harry had said, honest. "I mean, I didn't want you to feel obligated. Except perhaps you ought to have. That would have been the Slytherin thing to do. Pressure Malfoy so that he risked social disgrace by appearing too terrified to lunch with students from other houses." Malfoy had only sighed. That'll be why they agreed to it, then. Which Harry hadn't quite understood. Malfoy had gone on to helpfully add, "I've not exactly been on speaking terms with my housemates. It's difficult enough to reform your image wearing green and silver without saddling yourself with being associated with a Death Eater to boot." It had only been here that Harry had recalled both Zabini and Parkinson had left England after completing their compulsory education and had not, to his knowledge, returned since. Perhaps that had been part and parcel of distancing themselves from not just Malfoy, but anything to do with the wall. It was a tempting thing, Harry had to admit, and if he hadn't had Ron and Hermione and Teddy and Andromeda and everyone, he might have considered something along the same lines. He'd always wanted to travel, after all. "But that's ridiculous," he'd said instead. "They're your friends, aren't they? You're supposed to stick by your friends, even when they're murderers," Malfoy had cut in with a derisive little leer. But he'd failed to hide the exhaustion in his voice, clearly tired of arguing with Harry. Harry had felt a nugget of despair lodge in his throat, because it was in moments like this that he caught glimpses of the older Malfoy, creeping in, soft and subtly at the corners, like an ominous fog rolling in. And he'd worked too hard to let Malfoy start backsliding now. Malfoy's idle self-flagellation was unmoving. Harry had been there, after all, had seen what had happened atop that tower. Malfoy lacked the disposition for murder, though Harry didn't doubt he would have managed the Cruciatus in Myrtle's bathroom if Harry had given him the chance. So he just shrugged off the challenge. "My friends have stuck by me all this time, even though I've brought them a lot of shit in the doing. Plus I killed a bloke too, when I was 17, if you hadn't heard." "Must have slipped my mind somehow," Malfoy had drawled with a roll of his eyes. "So I reckon we've both got our skeletons." "Please, your lackeys have stuck by you through all the trauma you've caused them because they're Gryffindors, trained to be brave despite their better nature and in the face of certain doom, both literal and hyperbolic. Slytherins are quite the opposite." "Are they? Because the way I heard it most every year is, perhaps in Slytherin you'll meet your true friends." and Malfoy hadn't had a witty comeback to that, bringing his thumb to his lips and chewing nervously on the nail. I haven't apologized to them yet. Got a fair few apologies you need to work through then, don't you? Harry had tried to keep his tone light, but not teasing. Malfoy had cut him a wary look. You said your lot would give me a pass. They will, probably. Doesn't mean it wouldn't still be the decent thing to do. Malfoy had just grunted in response, hunched over small. Doesn't seem like it'd be right. Showing up out of the blue and asking to break bread with them, as if it's just another Hogsmeade weekend and I wasn't instrumental in making my house's good name synonymous with coward and backstabber and evil. You give yourself too much credit, Harry had said, dodging Malfoy's thrown leg. But maybe you could buy them a drink to start. And then Malfoy had sighed, let his head sink into his palms with a groan, and Harry had only just held back from doing a dancing little jig, clacking his heels together and all, because this meant he'd won. Hermione and Ron, of course, thought he was mad, though that was generally how they felt about anything involving Harry and Malfoy. However, given that this time there would be alcohol and pub grub on service, and Harry had assured them they needn't interact with Malfoy if they didn't care to, even though Malfoy would be, he assured them, on his very best behaviour, they agreed to come along. We shouldn't, Hermione had hedged, but Ron had jumped in helpfully with, come on, he's probably mucked up the timeline beyond repair by this point, and Hermione had blanched at the thought, so why not just roll with it? Besides, someone needs to make sure Malfoy keeps that forked tongue of his in his mouth. Hermione had nodded firmly at this, which Harry was pretty sure meant there was a hard right hook with Malfoy's name on it coming his way if he was even the tiniest bit snotty. Harry had to remind himself strongly he didn't want that to happen, no matter how satisfying it might be on some level. This was Malfoy's chance to prove he was worth consorting with. He kept banging on and on about wanting to save himself, being master of his own fate and all, so here Harry had lobbed him up a nice volley. It was up to him to send it rocketing. That he hadn't rejected the notion he needed a circle of support outright suggested to Harry that Malfoy was actually very lonely, so Harry hoped the others gave him a chance. That Malfoy let them give him a chance. Sure, maybe some of them, most of them even, hated his guts right now, either on principle as a Slytherin or because they'd come up against him during the darker moments of the war. But they might drum up a bit of respect for him if they saw him fighting, instead of just taking his beating lying down as he'd seemed content to do before Harry had shown up. As the Saturday in question dawned, Harry sent word around for the others to all meet at the Hogshead that afternoon. He'd bring up the rear with Malfoy to spare him the need to make any small talk while they waited for everyone to arrive. Malfoy's agreeing to participate in Harry's ridiculous house unity fantasy was predicated on the condition that Harry make good on his vow to sneak Malfoy down to the village through his private shortcut. Certain that Aberforth wouldn't appreciate Harry just popping into his sitting room via Ariana Dumbledore's portrait hanging over the mantel, Harry had decided to use the Honeyduke's entrance, which had become free to pass through once more with the defeat of Voldemort and rousting of the Death Eaters from the castle. He and Malfoy had parted ways the evening prior with a promise to meet in front of the statue of the humpbacked witch on the 3rd floor at precisely 4 o'clock. Don't make me come find you, Harry had warned, and Malfoy had shown him a finger or two, spitting back, piss off, stalker. But there he'd been, right on time. Early, even, already leaning against Gunhilda's statue, arms crossed over his chest by the time Harry had rounded the corner, and Harry had to remind his heart that there was no need to flutter about madly like that. It was just Hogsmeade. It sent a little twinge of nostalgia through Harry as he stood before the statue, Malfoy at his back, and spoke Descendium. He hadn't needed to use this entrance in years, a decade now, really, but there'd been a time when this had been his only way to escape the castle and spend time with his friends. He wondered what the marauders might think of his sharing it with the likes of Malfoy. How on earth did you find this? Malfoy asked, eyeing the dark staircase that unfurled behind Gunhilda's impressive hump with wary awe, as if he thought perhaps Harry himself had created it. My dad showed it to me, Harry answered in all honesty. Your what? But Harry had already started down the steps, beckoning Malfoy to follow. He probably thought Harry was balmy, and that was all right. They plodded along in darkness for quite a stretch. Harry had expected Malfoy to complain about the relative length of what was meant to be a shortcut to Hogsmeade, but he didn't. He didn't have much to say at all, actually, and Harry didn't feel the need to press him. Perhaps he was still steeling himself for the upcoming confrontation with Harry's friends and his own housemates, Or perhaps he just wasn't one for small talk. This was the most they'd interacted outside of the room, after all, barring that incident in the unused potions lab. Even if Harry had wanted to chat while they walked, he wouldn't have known what to start with. Everyone was already gathered round their table at the Hog's Head by the time Harry and Malfoy made it in, a few with half-empty mugs already in hand. Ron gave a bright, loud bellow of "Harry Potter!" which caused more than a few heads to swivel his way, and Harry wondered if he'd perhaps gotten started early in anticipation of having to spend a frightful afternoon in Malfoy's presence. Hermione quickly shushed him, though, and Harry scurried over, head ducked, with Malfoy close on his heels. The notice-me not he'd cast as they'd crept up out of the Honeyduke cellar had helped them keep a low profile while slinking through the crowded streets of Hogsmeade in the late afternoon, but not even his best spell work would keep them from being clocked now Ron had announced to all and sundry that Harry had arrived. "I got us a table here over the 3 broomsticks because I thought we'd get more privacy," Harry said pointedly, shrugging off his coat and sending it flying to the rack along the wall. "Kind of defeats the purpose when you put out a full-page advert like that." "Psh," Ron scoffed, nodding sagely to the barkeep. "Aberforth will keep us from being disturbed." He gave a few generous sniffs in Harry's direction. "Why do you smell like dirt?" "Came up through the Honeyduke's passage. Didn't want to bother with the crowd." Harry glanced around the table, taking stock of each face, old and new, and trying to gain a quick read of how they felt seeing Malfoy arriving on his arm. Just to the left of Hermione and Ron were sat Luna, Ginny, and Neville, with Seamus and Dean already well into what looked to be their own private drinking game next to them. Padma sat stiffly next to Parvati, who was rubbing shoulders with a gobsmacked Pansy Parkinson, while Blaise Zabini reclined against the banquette, fixing Malfoy with an expression Harry could not read. Malfoy was tense as a drawn bow at Harry's side, and Harry could tell that in his mind he was already hightailing it back to the castle. Well, tough shit. They were here now, and they were going to see this through. He herded Malfoy into one of the open seats and then slid in next to him, sandwiching him between Hermione and Harry so that he'd have to apparate out if he wanted to escape, something Harry didn't think was even possible with his ministry wand. Harry settled in and cleared his throat before anyone else could rethink their decision to attend this little get-together. "You all been waiting long?" Ron gestured around the table. "Luna and Ginny got here first. They came down early with a pack of 7th years who've just come of age and revelling in it." "Some of us still know the meaning of temperance, oh brother dearest," Ginny reminded with a flutter of her lashes. "It's rude to get started without all members of your party present, you know." She flicked Harry a warm grin, and Harry gave her a polite nod of thanks in return. He'd learned in the nearly 2 months now since his arrival that he and Ginny had already been broken up, so he was wary of giving her any degree of false hope. He knew this get-together hadn't happened in his own timeline and hoped that she didn't get the wrong idea about it. He wasn't certain how he might feel if, on returning to the future, he learned he had managed to keep Malfoy alive, but was now married 7 years to Ginny with 2 kids in a crop. It wasn't the worst future he could imagine by any means, but it was one he'd moved beyond, he felt. "Well, seeing as we're all here now, a round of drinks won't hurt, will it?" Harry signalled to Aberforth to set them up with something tame. Getting sauced too early in the evening wouldn't be any help in fostering the bonds Harry was hoping might take root tonight. "So, what were we talking about before Malfoy and I got here?" "Mostly about the fact we were waiting on you and Malfoy," Seamus said into the lip of his mug, taking another timely draw of his drink, and uneasy chuckles rippled around the group. Parkinson's face grew somehow even more pinched and pug-like, and Zabini wrinkled his nose and began to trace the whorls and knots of the old wood table with a carefully manicured nail, the picture of elegant boredom. Malfoy looked like he was trying to sink back into the banquette, and Harry wondered if the bulging vein at his temple meant he was struggling to master wandless apparition. Oh, bugger. Clearly, if he didn't steer the conversation himself, Malfoy was going to wind up on trial before his peers, and that could turn this otherwise friendly outing sour quick. While Harry had boasted that his friends wouldn't demand apologies from Malfoy, content if he simply managed to conduct himself decently, he couldn't be entirely sure that, after a few drinks, some might be a little less friendly towards someone who'd made their collective lives a living hell for the better part of the last half-decade. Even Harry found it difficult some days. "Well, I mean, stranger things have happened, yeah?" Neville looked like he'd just been struck by a bludger. Not really, I don't feel like." You must admit you make a very curious couple, Luna added, and God, Harry loved her, he really did, but he didn't need her characterizing their relationship with unnecessarily suggestive phrasing right now. Harry cleared his throat. Well, what about you guys? What have you been up to this year? He turned to Luna and Ginny, hopeful. Haven't really gotten to talk to either of you outside of mealtimes. How are classes going? Ginny lifted a brow. Harry, we share most of our newt classes, you know? And we see each other in charms every Monday, Luna added. But you're right, of course we don't chat nearly enough. Though silent companionship can be nice as well. She leaned forward to glance over at Malfoy. Wouldn't you say so, Draco? Malfoy stiffened, eyes gone wide and hunted, and he shrank away from Luna, which had him practically climbing into Harry's lap consequently, so naturally he leapt away from Harry as well and jostled Hermione in the doing, who spilled half her drink on Ron, sending him leaping to his feet with a squawk and a sharp, "What the fuck do you think you're trying with Hermione, Malfoy?" as he brandished his wand, eyes blazing. God, forget the Dementors. He was going to get Malfoy killed tonight.